Welcome everybody to another Developer Livecast chat here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel. We got a great one for you today. As always, for our topic, we're going to be talking about designing a narrative-focused game or narrative adventure title. And joining me is the lead designer and creator on the game, A Case of Distrust. By the time you're watching this live, it should be out by next week. And for those of you watching this in archive form, it will be already out. So please welcome to the cast, Ben Wander, or as he's known online, A Wandering Ben, or The Wandering Ben.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm doing great, Ben. How are you doing today?
It's pretty good. Sunny Saturday. Can't complain.
Yeah, we're over here on the East Coast where it seems to be fluctuating between freezing cold or like a nice temperate weather. So everything's all messed up around here.
Yeah, winter weather's kind of fickle everywhere, huh?
But it's great to have you on. For those of you who don't know, A Case of Distrust is being published by Serenity Forge, and my friend Z over there introduced us. So thank you, Z, if you're watching.
Yeah, for sure. Serenity Forge is doing a great job helping out with the game's release. They made a fantastic release trailer. They're, putting us in touch. It's great. It's doing stuff that I couldn't really do on my own. So big thanks to them.
Yeah, and it's always great to talk to developers who are getting started on the indie side of things. I know when we spoke on email, you used to work at Visceral Studios as well as one other one, right?
Yeah, actually, I've worked at a bunch of places, and normally I don't list them all because it's way too long. But probably the two biggest ones were Visceral Games and BioWare. And then, yeah, a whole bunch like Silicon Knights, this mobile studio called XMG, EA Mobile, which was a lot of fun also. Yeah, just hopped around a bunch of places.
Great. And with A Case of Distrust, is this your, I guess, first full-on indie title, or have you made any other games since you left those studios?
No, yeah, this was the reason I left. I wanted to make this game specifically. So it's been 2.5 years since I left Visceral, and it's crazy. It's almost out. I mean, man, this has been my life for so long. I don't know what I'm gonna do with myself.
I hear from a lot of other indie devs as well that they take on this massive game, and then it's finished, and it's like, now what do I do? Free time is back once again.
Right. Seriously. I mean, I started going back to the gym and I went, "What is this? I don't." They have weights there now. Did you know that? I didn't know.
No, I didn't know that. Sounds like a strange and wonderful place.
Right.
But we'll be talking more about A Case of Distrust in a few minutes, as well as talking more about creating the game as well. But to get things started, as we just mentioned, in terms of the studios you've worked at, could you talk a little bit more about, I guess, your general background when it comes to the game industry for people watching?
Sure. Yeah, I went to school for computer science, which is programming basically, and then I started in the industry as an intern at EA Mobile, which was a lot of fun. And I did a bit of design work and programming work at EA Mobile, and then I moved into Silicon Knights, and then BioWare, and then Visceral Games, all doing programming at all three places. And then at Visceral, I swapped over to design again because I found it a lot of fun and was doing a lot of the multiplayer design on the downloadable side of Battlefield Hardline. That was the last game we made there. Yeah, before that, again, I was working on Dragon Age at BioWare, Dragon Age Inquisition. So I did a lot of the navigation programming for that, for the exploration stuff. We had to, that was the first really the first game that wasn't a Battlefield game that used the Frostbite engine, so we had to really twist its arm to get it to do what we wanted. But yeah, that was fun. And hopping around the industry, you get to experience different ways of doing things, different team structures, different roles for producers, for designers. Are they technical? Are they doing more scripting, or is it more document design work and it's the programmers that are more the gameplay guys? It varies everywhere, so it's really interesting to go to so many different studios and understand kind of how the industry works on a variety of different levels. That was a lot of fun.
And So it's been very interesting, like watching the AAA market, at least from this side the last few years. I know, sadly, Visceral went out earlier, or yeah, in late 2017. And I know BioWare's certainly been having some interesting troubles with their game. I think Anthem, and of course a whole Mass Effect trouble or Mass Effect debacle that happened last year.
Yeah, I don't think I know anyone who worked on that Mass Effect game. I worked at BioWare Edmonton, which was the first BioWare studio, and then they spun one up in Austin to work on the MMO, and then I think they spun up Montreal pretty recently to just to work on Mass Effect Andromeda. And I've heard the same rumors you have. I can't really speak any further to that, but they sound founded, I guess. But I don't have any insider information for that studio. Visceral as well. I mean, it was almost exactly 2 years after I left that they shut down. So I can just say that it was my fault. I left and then they closed, obviously. No, but yeah, a lot of really really good hardworking people that I knew personally there, that were out of work for reasons that weren't in their control. And thankfully, a lot of those men and women have found homes in other parts of the industry, which is good. I mean, it's a small space. You meet a lot of people. There's always a game that needs to be made somewhere. But yeah, it was crazy. I mean, there were really high emotions after that studio shut down, and I don't envy the people who were there. I do envy their severance. I quit and didn't get any, and they got a bunch of severance. Damn it! I should have just stayed on, right?
Yeah, you could have saved the studio single-handedly too.
Right, exactly. Of course I could have. Exactly.
But as you said a few minutes ago, with the A Case of Distrust, this was a game that you really wanted to make. I guess besides like narrative adventure or crafting these kinds of games, are there any other genres you like to play in your spare time, Ben?
Oh man, I play every genre. I don't think you could find a genre of game that I don't play, and I think that's kind of true of a lot of game developers. I mean, even developers. I was talking to Rami Ishmael the other, I forget, like at PAX or something, and I'm making a narrative adventure game, and he was just hanging out, and he said, "Hey, what's this? It looks interesting." And I said, "Man, it's not going to be anything you like. It's nothing like the games that you make." And he said, "Dude, I play everything." And I went, "I play everything too." And so I think even if you see people who only make one style of game or one genre, or might focus on an actiony thing, maybe that's what they like making, because it is different making each type of game. But that doesn't mean that they don't play sort of everything. So yeah, I mean, anything that's good that comes in my radar, I will try to put some time into it. I still haven't played The Witcher 3. I'm sorry. Maybe that's like post development, when after this game comes out, I can just have a month of sitting down in front of The Witcher and playing that.
From what people are telling me, you may need more than a month to play
Yeah,
that
it could
one.
be. It could be.
Yeah, and I'm the same way. I pretty much try everything. We were just talking before we went live here that both Ben and I apparently are playing the Anno game, Anno 1404, like around the same time this past week. So
Yeah,
there's
a
some.
game that's 10 years old or so. I don't know how old that game is. I don't know how it was so random that we were both
Yeah.
playing that game. That's amazing.
And for those of you who are new to Game Wisdom, we do every Saturday night that I play 3 games voted on by the fans. So they go through my massive backlog of games I have on Steam. So I just play all manner of random games on there, whether it's a AAA or an indie game. With like there's no real pattern to it. So like one night I'll play some like hardcore adventure game. Next game I'll play is like a cute match 3 puzzle game. So you never know what's going to pop up on the list. But with that said, getting back to the topic, then I guess in terms of making A Case of Distrust, we'll move on and discuss that for a little bit. I guess what inspired you, or what made you decide to quit working at a studio and make this kind of game?
Yeah, so for a while, I mean, we were talking about how I kind of play a lot of different types of games, and one thing that I really liked about independent games when I was working in AAA was that they were doing a lot of really new things. I mean, they still are, and the AAA space, for a variety of reasons, can't take as many risks
Oh
as
yes.
independent game developers. And I sort of, looked at myself and went, okay, what is it? Everybody sort of has this analysis of, okay, here's where I am. Where do I want to be? And I realized that probably the type of experience that I wanted to make that I hadn't done yet would have been something that I could only do in the indie space. And so I knew that I had to leave and forge my own path and make my own thing. And maybe I did the thing that people tell you you're not supposed to do, which is I quit my job without knowing what I was going to do. So I just kind of, pulled the ripcord and went, oh, okay, now I'm just floating in the air. What happens next? I didn't really know. But I'd been obsessed with the 1920s for a good couple of years before quitting my job, and I just really loved that period of gray area politics and prohibition, which led to gangsterism, and how they were the bad guys, but in some ways the good guys, depending on who you asked and what you wanted. There's just a whole interesting mix of things that happened in between 1920 and 1929 that hadn't really been deeply explored in video games, even though you'd seen some movies and some TV shows and a lot of books that take place in that era. And so I found that really interesting. And I always grew up loving mysteries as well. And when it came to deciding, okay, what type of game do I want to make, it made a lot of sense to make a mystery game, because there aren't a lot of those, and set it in the 1920s, because again, I love that period, and I love historical fiction also. So it worked out that I kind of quit and then decided on what to do. Maybe that's not the smartest thing. Maybe I should have spun my wheels a little bit longer, but I think it went okay.
And what you just said there, Ben, about wanting to make a game that you wouldn't see in the AAA market, I've heard that so many times from indie developers, and it really is true that the independent space is where we really see just some of the most unique games out there. I mean, hell, over 2017, the amount of games I played from the independent space is just staggering at this point.
Yeah, and what I love about them is I can get their full experience in a very short amount of time. So my favorite game probably last year was What Remains of Edith Finch, and that game takes 2 hours, maybe 3 hours to play through, and it was the most wonderful thing that I had experienced the whole year. I thought it was fantastic, and just that idea of I can pick this up. I can have the experience. I can take it with me. It's unique. I think it was Snowman Games that has this thing of a game that you don't stay with for very long, but that stays with you for a very long time. I really love that idea of, it doesn't have to be this big, huge 100-hour epic game. It could just do something really unique and beautiful, and it sticks with you for a very long time. And that's what I see the indie space doing that is risky and doesn't always hit. And for AAA to do that would be kind of crazy at the budgets they're talking about, So it made sense to me to jump ship and to go indie.
Yeah, but not only that, but some games you really can't sustain that same level of experience for 10, 20, 30 hours of game time. There's just not enough there in terms of story, or the game mechanics may just not be that involved enough that you can grow it or stretch it out.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I loved Edith Finch, and I would not have wanted it to be 1 minute longer. I mean, that game was exactly the length that it needed to be.
Now, I think another very interesting point about, as we've seen with independent development, has to be, again, that I guess here's a very interesting question we've had. I'm sure one that you've thought, or I'm sorry, my brain is like going in 18 different directions. One thing about independent development I think is very interesting, and getting back to what you said with A Case of Distrust, is that you can really explore these themes and topics that we wouldn't otherwise seen. I have a friend who's working on the game Bullock Mayan Warfare, and his whole idea was he really wanted to do something based in Mayan and Aztec mythology. And he said there really weren't a lot of games, or not many games you could even think of, that went down that topic. And it's always interesting to see these blind spots, I think, when it comes to crafting a game around them. As you said, with like building him around 1920, 1930 in terms of prohibition and the rise of gangsters. You're right. I can't think of too many games. I guess maybe like one like the Mafia games, but again, that's more from an action standpoint rather than trying to, I guess, fill out what that time was.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good time for people to go indie, honestly, because I think there are a lot of these blind spots that we haven't really experienced in games quite yet. And we have the tools nowadays to make game development not painless. I'm not going to sit here and say that it doesn't take a lot of hard work. Obviously, I spent quite a lot of time making this game, but you can do it without needing the 100-person staff that you might have needed 5 years ago, or even, the 50-person staff that you needed 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's a lot easier to have an idea and to be able to take that risk because you don't need to be paying a full staff. You don't need, to get health insurance for 50 people or something. It can be more of an art piece, and it can sustain you and maybe the few people that you make the game with, without needing to sell. I mean, I always say this, right, is if my game sells the rounding error of a Battlefield game, that's a success. I mean, did the last Battlefield game sell 15.1 million or 15.2?
Yeah.
It doesn't give me that discrepancy, and I'll be completely fine. We're totally good.
Oh yeah. And as you said a few minutes ago, with the level of risk that's involved in the AAA space, it's always very interesting when we talk about what it means to succeed in the game industry. As you just said, like, 100,000, 200,000 copies to an independent developer is basically a breakout smash success. For a AAA developer, that's considered like a dismal failure.
And, yeah, if a game doesn't sell 5 million these days,
yes,
it's considered a failure. Yeah, absolutely.
And as you just said as well, when it comes to the independent side of things, when you're just, one or two people working on a game, you are certainly not spending the same amount of money that EA did for Battlefront 2 or anything like that. And that's another really great luxury that independent developers have been able to make use of. That you can make a game with 4 or 5 people, and it can be an amazing title. Or it could just be an okay one, but it's not like you just broke your entire studio's budget trying to make that game.
Yeah, and I think that risk is really important to take because that's what independent game development can offer that the AAA space just can't because of what it is. So whenever I see, young independent game developers, people who are just trying to break in and stuff, sometimes you'll see studios like this just trying to make a first-person multiplayer game. And they're just not going to be able to compete with Call of Duty because Call of Duty has hundreds of people working on it every single year. They have the marketing budget, they have the chops to get whatever actor that they want to put in there. If I see your game and Call of Duty and I want to play that type of game, I'll pick Call of Duty 100 times out of 100. The interesting space is where AAA can't reach because the profits aren't there. It doesn't matter how good my game is, it won't sell 15 million copies. It just won't. And I don't need it to. And that's what's fantastic about this space is that I can tailor my game to a more niche market that might appreciate a game like mine, and it doesn't have to appeal, broadly to everybody. If it just connects with you in that one special way, then that's enough for me.
Yeah. And even if we see games of similar genres from the independent space, they can have vastly different designs. I mean, one of my favorite examples is the platformer genre. It has been a bread and butter of independent developers now for, I think, probably just about a decade. But there is a huge difference between playing a game like Super Meat Boy versus something like Celeste that just came out, or any of the other games of that genre. Because everyone can really put their own different take on it. And, like, as you said, Sengo, regarding something like Call of Duty, like, when we talk about a big budget game like that, oh, my voice is dying. Oh, man. When we talk about a big budget game like that, there are usual telltale markers that you see. When you play Call of Duty versus Battlefield versus Battlefront, there's very similarities to it. But when we talk about the independent side, There is no such thing like that. Yes, you may be running and jumping in one platformer to the next, but what you're doing as the unique points are vastly different.
Yeah, there's a lot more authorial control possible in the indie space because again,
Yeah.
you're a team of very small people that again can make a game that doesn't need to appeal to everyone. So there might be people that I'm sure there are people out there who love Super Meat Boy but hate Spelunky, even
Mm-hmm.
though they're similar in a lot of ways. You're running, you're jumping, you're doing some things, but
Mm-hmm.
they're one's very high paced, action heavy, super great, and then the other one is, you're climbing more, you're trying to use items, you're doing things like that. There, if
Mm-hmm.
I described each of those games to you, and you weren't a big game player, you might say, oh, that sounds like essentially the same game. But it appeals to just enough different people
Mm-hmm.
that they're not going to reach everybody, but they reach enough people to be, well, for those two, extremely successful. But even if they sold, a tenth of what they sold, I'm sure those studios would still be profitable.
Yeah.
And that's why they can take authorial risks like that, which is huge, which I think is really what's moving the industry forward.
Mm-hmm. It's basically a case of indirect competition that yes, everyone is trying to, compete for your dollars and for consumer attention, but it's not a case where if I buy Spelunky, that means I don't need to buy The End Is Nigh or Celeste or Iconicast or any of those other games. No, they're all different in their own approach. So it's not like, as we said, like if I buy Call of Duty, chances are I'm not going to immediately turn around and buy Battlefront or Battlefield.
Yeah, and because of that, I really find the indie space very, very supportive. That was a really big deal for me after. So I developed this game for the first year of it in Southeast Asia. I was traveling around with my girlfriend, and while we were traveling, I was making this game, and that was a lot of fun in terms of traveling. But it made me feel really isolated from the development community, and this was a community that I hadn't really interacted with because I was in the AAA space and I hadn't known a lot of the indies. So when I first came back and started going to trade shows, I wasn't really sure what to expect. I felt very alone and isolated, and immediately that community just, became
Mm-hmm.
so supportive. And so interested in what I was doing, and they started pitching my game to other people because they thought it was really cool, and then I started pitching their games to other people, and it's I don't know, it's this sort of warm bath of love. That's a really terrible metaphor. I don't know what I'm saying. It feels really nice and supportive, and I think a lot of that is like you said, because I can be successful and they can be successful, and the 30 other people in this room
Mm-hmm.
can also be successful all at the same time.
Nobody's trying to stab each other in the back, basically.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that level of transparency is great. I mean, the fact that I'm sitting here talking to you is definitely proof positive. Like, I can send email to an independent developer and they can respond to me. It's amazing. Like, I don't need to go through a massive PR department or talk to 27 people to try to get hold of someone to have an interview with.
Did you not go through my PR department? Oh man, I
Uh,
really need to make some calls.
yeah.
Okay.
How about your agent? Was I supposed to talk to them too?
Well, it goes from my manager to my agent to my publisher and then to me. So something probably broke down. I'll,
Yeah.
I'll give them all a call. Yeah. Thanks for letting me know.
All right. And as you were just saying, man, that you were traveling in Southeast Asia while you were starting to work on A Case of Distrust, it reminds me of when I spoke with two of the three members of the game, the Dark Side Detective. I think the company was Spooky Door, or The Spooky Door. And they were talking about to cut down costs. They were just basically doing like globe trotting around Europe while they were working on that game. And again, like for like AAA development, it sounds like very crazy, but I've heard this from so many indie developers who have been around all parts of the world while they're working on their game.
Yeah, I mean it's very doable these days, and kind of my reasons were budgetary also initially, but even forgetting about the budget, it's just fun to be in a different place, and you can work, your regular 9 to 5 at any coffee shop or co-working space with a laptop and some Wi-Fi, and you're set, you're good.
Hmm.
And then at night, you're in a completely different place, and you spend your weekends on some random beach in a country that you've never heard of, and it's a lot of fun to be able to create something and still have all that inspiration around you from all these different places. And then you make friends randomly around the world who end up, being your friends for a very long time. So it's really good. I would highly recommend it to anyone who's thinking about it.
Awesome. So I think with that, let's move on and talk a little bit about A Case of Distrust, and then we'll move into our final topic and talk more about creating like a narrative focused game and your thoughts on that. So, like I said, for those of you watching this live, we had a few people come in and out. There must be something going on Saturday because we're not getting too many people. But for those of you watching this recorded, A Case of Distrust will be out by the time you're watching this. So, for people who haven't heard of the game or maybe seeing it on Steam, what's the elevator pitch for it?
Yeah, so A Case of Distrust is a narrative mystery that takes place in 1924 in San Francisco. And you play as private investigator Phyllis Malone, and she's trying to solve a case of deceit and deception. Kind of what that means in not elevator pitch speak is it's kind of a mix between a choose your own adventure and kind of a narrative, like a narrative choose your own adventure and an old school point and click game. So you're going to different real locations in San Francisco in 1924 and clicking around different parts of different rooms, finding evidence, and then using that evidence while talking to characters to contradict them or to, ask them if they know anything about this thing. And so it plays a little bit like Phoenix Wright, a little bit like Hotel Dusk, and its art style is kind of unique in the game space. It's based on a poster designer from the 1950s. His name is Saul Bass, and he did a lot of. If you Google him, you'll see. He did the Vertigo poster. He did a bunch of Stanley Kubrick stuff. Like you will recognize his work. And it's a very very bold colors, very defined silhouettes, and that was sort of the starting inspiration for it. It didn't stay exactly in his style, but it's still close enough, and he's definitely the main inspiration artistically for this game. And then the audio is done by a really good friend of mine, Mark Wilson, who I used to work with at BioWare, and he also worked on LA Noire before that. And he found out that I was working on this 1920s game, and he said, "Man, let me make the music for you because I'm so into this." And I went, "Sure, fine, let's do it," because I know nothing about audio. So he was very, very helpful when it came to that, for sure.
And like for my own background, I really love like the 1920s, 1930s, like that kind of big band, orchestral music. It was one of the things that really stood out to me when I played Cuphead in 2017.
Yeah, Cuphead. I think Cuphead is like 50s or something.
Okay.
But for sure, I mean that music. You can see the evolution of that music, right? Taking it from the dance halls of the 20s, you can kind of see it popularized. And the thing is that the music that was in Cuphead is very similar to the music that was around in the 1920s, except it was very taboo. Going to dance clubs was not a thing that you were supposed to do. It was a thing that these new young flappers who rebelled from their parents would go out and sneak out at night and do in their fancy new automobiles, and then kind of how it happens with every genre, right? Like rock and roll is the most is the most common genre these days, but when that came out in the 60s and 70s, parents were losing their minds. Like, what's happening? What is my kid doing? And so kind of similarly, that sort of dance hall music and jazz in a lot of ways too became a lot more mainstream by the time the 50s came around and Cuphead was a thing.
Basically, everything is the devil when it first comes out. I think that's how it works in the United States.
Right. Well, and everywhere, I think.
Yeah.
That's legitimate.
And I'm glad you mentioned Phoenix Wright as an inspiration or as kind of a comparison, because the second I saw the word contradiction on there, it immediately popped into my head.
Yeah, no, Phoenix Wright is a really good game, and I love that mechanic of,
Hmm.
you're the character is on the stand in the Phoenix Wright game, and they're telling you something, and you know one thing that they're saying to you is a lie, and you know that you have something in your notebook
Hmm.
that can contradict that. The way that A Case of Distrust works, is that you actually don't know if someone's lying to you or not. They might be telling the truth, or they might be telling the truth about one thing and not the other. And you kind of have the opportunity to contradict them at any point if you want.
Hmm.
And you don't know really if you have anything in your notes that could contradict this or not, or if you haven't found it yet. And so maybe you have to go somewhere first and then contradict what they just told you. And so it's sort of like a I tried to build on that mechanic a little bit to make it more like a private detective who wouldn't know,
Hmm.
hey, is this person actually guilty of something? Are they lying to me because they're guilty? Are they lying to me because they want to hide something but they aren't actually guilty of anything? Or are they straight up telling me the truth? I thought, in a lot of mystery novels and TV shows and detective films and things like that, that was a really interesting element that I hadn't seen a lot of games do of trying to detect who's lying to you and why they're trying to lie to you.
Hmm. And at these kinds of games, as you said, there's you're always like presumed that everyone is lying to you, that everything is just a one big massive puzzle. And it's very hard to kind of like break that convention for a lot of these adventure style games.
Yeah, I mean, not everybody in the game will lie to you, uh, but there will be lies that aren't necessarily related to the murder, or to the mystery. And so yeah, it's not always, even if they're lying to you, it might not always be the reason that you think they are. I'll put it that way. I'm trying not to spoil too much. I think I already went way further than I should have, but I'll stop there.
All right. I guess to try and distract people then. In terms, again, going back to the 1920s, 1930s for the inspiration for A Case of Distrust, did you do like any like research for it or like anything on your end to kind of like help expand your own knowledge on it?
Oh, so much. Absolutely. So again, before I even started this game, I just became really obsessed with that era. I think it started with the HBO show Boardwalk Empire. And I fell in love with that for a number of reasons, but one of them was the era that I thought was really really cool, and I just started doing research on it. Again, I'm sitting here at my desk looking on my bookshelf, and I'm seeing books that I've had for a while, like the history of the NYPD. There's a book on the Barbary Coast, which is kind of just before the 1920s in San Francisco, and I just started getting really interested in this time period. And once I knew that I was making this game, I really, really did a lot more research. I started researching a lot of the fashion, a lot of the era slang, a lot of the technology that was around, a lot of the politics, and of course, prohibition and how that led to gangsters and how that led to a lot of bribery and corruption that still kind of exists today. It's crazy, but a lot of it might be traced back to that period. And then even smaller details than that. I mean, I spent a lot of time at the San Francisco Public Library just poring over their historical records on, microfilm or microfiche or whatever they call it, and looking at newspaper clippings and seeing what was in the news that day and why and what did people care about. How were advertisements worded? How did people speak to one another, and what slang did they use? Small little details like that I think really add a lot to the world.
Hmm.
And that can be dangerous. I mean, sometimes I might make a mistake and not realize it and then be terrified. So I think there are no mistakes in there now, but I'm certain that if there are, someone will point it out. But let me give you an example that really caught me by surprise. There was a moment when you're in a taxi cab, and there was a line that said, "The taxi cab driver looked at me through the rearview mirror." Well, it turns out that the rear view mirror was only standard on cars starting in the mid 1930s. And while you could buy an add on rear view mirror in the 20s, that would look really weird and awkward to somebody in that period. They would have no idea what that would be, and they would for sure comment on it. It wouldn't just be this throwaway line of, "Oh, he just looked at me through." They'd be like, "What is that? Why do you have a mirror randomly stuck on your windscreen?" And so it's little details like that that can really come back to bite you. But I think I've I've taken a lot of pains to do research on the period to hopefully make it accurate enough so that you can play it and have a good time and then maybe learn some things along the way. And that's what I really, really like about historical fiction in general. And I'm hoping that I can do with A Case of Distrust.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a very long-winded answer. I'm not sure if I answered what you initially asked.
I think that got most of it, but
okay. If I keep talking, eventually I'll answer every question, right?
Great. I won't even need to ask you any more questions. You'll just do it all for me. And as I was just saying, I'm sure once a game is released, that everyone will pour over the continuity. They'll definitely let you know if there are any mistakes left in there.
Yeah, I'm sure I'll hear about it. Actually, please tell me about it because nowadays I can patch a game, so like don't let it be inaccurate. But yeah, no, there's a lot of historical tidbits in there that I think are going to be really fun for people.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. That's interesting. Loose Tube in Chow saying, there's anything really obscure, we need to have like a tooltip or some kind of system that would explain the term in a modern context. I was trying to think, like I was just reading what you wrote there, Loose Tube. I'm sure there are games that have done that in the past, but I cannot think of any off the top of my head. I guess for you, Ben, can you think of any games that, like, if there's like historical information or lore there, they pop up with that kind of tooltips? I guess maybe even something like Pyre from last year.
Yeah,
from
I was just thinking of Pyre, exactly. Yeah, I thought that mechanic was brilliant, and when I saw it, I thought, man, I should have stolen that.
Exactly.
No, that's really good, and the idea of having text that highlights. And that you can mouse over or controller over your cursor and see what it see the context of it is a really good way to do that. I was asked the question recently of because I don't have any tooltips like that, how do I make the game historical and interesting for people who want that, but also not make it sound like a textbook to people who just want to play through the game? And I really think that games are good at doing that, especially games like this that has a lot of narrative choice in it. There's a lot of moments in the game where you can choose to talk about something or not bring it up at all. Or, the taxi cab drivers, you're often going from location to location in taxi cabs. Those aren't relevant to the story, but they do add a whole bunch to the world and to the setting and to all of that stuff. So you can choose to not engage in that, or you can choose to, okay, I'm interested. Let's see, what does this guy have to say about this time period, or what is he doing after work, things like that, that I think really add to the lore of it if you want to go out and find it. And so I did that with choices. I think Pyre did an excellent job with tooltips, and I hope more developers steal that because I think it's a really cool mechanic. But yeah, I think there's clever ways that games can do that maybe other media can't. If you read a book, it's generally a linear book, and you're either reading it or you're not. So if they want to explain a lot of history to you, you have to go through it. Same with a film or a TV show or anything. With a game, it's more interesting because you can sort of hide it away in corners that if the player really wants to look for it, they can find that, but you're not forcing it down people's throat. If you just want to play a fun mystery detective game, that's also in there too. Just ignore all that history stuff and you'll be fine.
Or, of course, the other really big example would be the Dark Souls series and how so much of that lore of the world is basically confined to the item descriptions and the stuff you pick up. But if you just want to go around and fight giant monsters, you can do that. If you want to explore this massive history that people have made like 2-3 hour long videos on YouTube about, that's also there as well. Right.
Yeah. Another game that comes to mind is the Civilization series that sort of has that historical database in there for you to click on. I always feel like I should read more of that than I do. Maybe there's a way for them to incorporate a bit more of that into the game to hook you in to try to learn something. But I remember the original Mass Effect. I went through every damn journal entry in that original game just to see what they thought of, and it was so cool. The fact that Pluto Pluto's orbit stabilized after they realized the moon of Pluto was actually a Mass Effect relay, and they moved it, and then Pluto's moon is now stable. Pluto's orbit is now circular, just like everything else, and little things like that I thought were brilliant. Or how come language isn't a barrier in the Mass Effect universe? Well, it turns out everybody just has like a little device on them that automatically translates whatever everyone says. I mean, obviously from a gameplay standpoint, they needed that to not exist. They didn't want a language barrier there. But I thought it was just fascinating that they took the time to describe why that happened, and they put that in their journal. So I mean, yeah, I played that game, I think, in college, so I had a lot more free time back then. I don't know if I would go through all of the journal entries in any game right now, but if developers take the effort, it'll be appreciated by somebody. And so that's kind of the route that I took with A Case of Distrust. Even if there's a lot of people who just want to play through the game and not hear any of the history, that's fine, because I know there's enough of a subset of people that do want to learn about it. And who knows, maybe this could be a springboard to something that they'd want to learn and do more research on their own, kind of how Boardwalk Empire was for me, I guess.
Yeah, and I'm always a fan too, as well, when developers start to try and flesh out the world like that, and they start building the connection between how things work and what the player experiences. And I think that ultimately does lead to a lot more interesting narratives and just a lot more interesting worlds, rather than just saying everything is just happening because the developer says it's happening.
Yeah, that's a huge deal, especially when building out a world. When doing something like a Mass Effect or a Dragon Age, where it's a world that you're asking the player to believe you that all of this is real. It's really important, I think, especially in those contexts, to make them, if they search for it, if they seek it out, if they have that question, to make the answer available for them of like, okay, here is how this works and here's why.
Now, getting back to A Case of Distrust, one thing that I want to ask you, Ben, I'm not sure this will be considered a spoiler or not, but did you design the game to have multiple endings, or is there just one set way through?
Yeah, so there's a single culprit at the end of the game. So and that's important for the game's themes and kind of for what I'm trying to say with it. There are different ways to get there, depending on who you accuse and when and why. So there's never a fail state to the game. You can't ever get into a place where, oh, you were wrong and you just failed. But you can get into some places where, you say something to a guy and he doesn't like you anymore, and so he won't give you information as easily as he would have otherwise. And so, yeah, that stuff's interesting. I wouldn't say that there's enough permutations to require, multiple playthroughs for you to see everything. For sure, you won't see everything the first time through, but I mean, I guess it depends with how you want to play games. But for me, I like playing like games like that and thinking, okay, this is my story. I pissed off this guy and I accused her, but eventually I found this other thing in this other room that let me realize that the real culprit was this guy. So, I like when games give you that option to do things. There was a talk recently, a GDC talk about loss aversion, and I can't remember the guy's name who gave it. It was the guy who made Space Cadets, but I forget his name. And he was talking about how just having the option there, even though 99% of people aren't going to take it, I was thinking about my game and talking to somebody else about it, of, most people don't really accuse that many people in the game because they get really invested in the detective and being a detective, and a real cool detective doesn't go around and just saying, you did it, you did it, you did it, until they find the right person, but giving you that option, letting you know that, hey, at any point you can just accuse someone that they did this thing, right, is cool. It's interesting that the game lets you do that even though you might not want to, and it sort of opens up this possibility space while still you probably will constrain yourself. It is there, and it was hard to program to have all of those permutations available. It did take some effort, but I think it's worth it in the end.
Yeah, I just imagine that would be like kind of like my detective style. It's going around saying you're the murderer. No, you're the murderer. Just like accuse everybody. That's the. Eventually, you gotta get right. I mean, at some point.
Well, that was actually a big deal when designing this game, right?
Mhm.
It's how can I tell that the player knew what they were doing without randomly clicking on it? How can basically once the player knows, and there's multiple sort of little things that you have to solve in
Mhm.
within the game, and so I go, okay, once the player has gotten past this one thing that they have to solve, once they realize it, I don't want to add a bunch of friction there. If they understand it in their head, I want them to, be able to snap their fingers and go on to the next scene. At the same time, if they don't know what's going on, I don't want them to progress until that they do. I don't want them to just randomly click on a button and be able to go through it.
Mhm.
Designing that system, it turned out to be a lot trickier than
Yeah.
than I initially thought. Yeah, we talked earlier how there weren't that many mystery games, and I think that is a little bit part of the problem, right? Is
Mhm.
you have to know when your players know, and that's a tricky thing to solve a lot of the time.
Definitely. And I was just about to say that, like, for a game like A Case of Distrust, or for like this kind of like mystery element, it's very tricky, I think, to train the player to not go right towards like those gaming instincts or game design instincts because like for people who play adventure games, we know if you give the player five different dialogue tooltips, we should go down each and every one because maybe one of those will open up the path forward. Maybe one of these will solve a puzzle in a future point. But with a game like A Case of Distrust, as you said, like it's possible to say the wrong thing and close something off. Now, granted, you're not going to lose the game, but you are creating those hard choices. You are creating those walls that, if you're not careful, you will block something going forward.
Yeah, exactly. And so it was important for the game to have, again, at these distinct
Mm-hmm.
little moments where you have to sort of pass a test. The game gives you a quiz. Do you know what's happening? You should know what's
Mm-hmm.
happening. There are multiple ways for you to figure out what's going on. And some of those ways might be a little easier if you say the right thing, and some
Mm-hmm.
of those might end up, like you said, being locked off. But you'll still, again, it's still the one mystery.
Yeah.
So that's why I think if I were to encourage somebody to play this game, I'd say just try it once and then have that be your story.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah.
at least that's how I think about it. But hey, if you buy the game, play it however you want.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what you just said there is a very interesting point, Ben, about having that one story, that one playthrough. Because I've heard this a lot from people who play narrative driven games like Mass Effect or The Walking Dead or anything along those lines where there is a that there is replayability. There are these hard choices that will send you down different paths. But for a lot of people, they typically don't do that. And I think I'm the same way. Like once I play a game like that, basically that play is mine. Like if you go back to it, it kind of loses that mystique of going through it, that first playthrough.
Yeah, I agree with that. Absolutely. I think I saw a friend of mine play through the first Mass Effect, my roommate in college, and I played through it first, and then I saw him playing through it, and I just couldn't believe the things that he was doing. I mean, this is not Mass Effect. Are you kidding me? You're playing some fan fiction that someone wrote. This isn't the story that I know and went through.
Hmm.
But yeah, that's just how it is for me. That's how I play those types of games. So,
Hmm.
I don't want to give maybe it is in a little ways similar to Mass Effect. I don't want to give the wrong impression of this game has Case of Distress has all these crazy number of permutations and you can get to the
Hmm.
ending 27 different ways. Like no, it's not that, but there are these little moments. And again, the way that I thought of it wasn't really branching the story, it was branching the characters. It
Hmm.
was how do these characters react to you differently depending on what you say to them.
Yeah. And I think that's a very interesting point there because, again, for a lot of people, it's very tricky to figure out what they want in terms of that kind of choice. As you said, with something like Mass Effect, I mean, they built up gameplay choices over the course of three different games and still pissed off a lot of people at the very end.
Right.
And then you have like something on the flip side with Telltale where the choices are very personal, but they have very little gameplay impact. Like no matter what happens, if I play through like The Wolf Among Us, which was the last one I really enjoyed, or if you play through it, chances are we're both going to see the exact same story play out. But our little choices there may have these slight changes to it.
Yeah, and I personally like that because it lets them tell a cohesive story
Mm-hmm.
while still giving these little personality traits to the game to flavor it your way. I think what Telltale is brilliant at, and unfortunately what a lot of people have figured out since, The Wolf Among Us and things
Mm-hmm.
like that, is that it doesn't really affect the game that much,
Yeah.
but they're brilliant at making you feel like it might.
Mm-hmm.
Every time you do something, there's this big text that pops up on screen that says they'll remember that, and you go, "Oh man, how is this going to?" And most of the time it doesn't do anything. But I remember the first time playing through The Walking Dead, I thought I was making all of these crazy important decisions, and it was just that idea that I think carried me through that game that I thought was absolutely brilliant.
Mm-hmm. I think for me, unfortunately, like once I kind of like saw behind the curtain, it kind of robbed a lot of the mystique out of the Telltale games for me. Like I said, the last one that I played through was The Wolf Among Us, but I just haven't really felt the drive to play anything else from them since.
Yeah, yeah, I can see that. And again, it's one of those things of don't look behind the
Yeah.
curtain because you're not going to like what you find there.
Yeah. And comment from chat from LooseTube about having multiple options, let there be multiple stories, and I think that's a really good segue to telling more about A Case of Distrust, because one of the things that I saw in the game, and I'm sure you can comment on here as well, Ben, is how there are many moments that you basically choose like how our protagonist responds or thinks about something. Like again, without spoiling things too much, but in the opening scene, there's a part where you can decide how she responds to getting a letter from her sister. Does she like getting that information, or does she hate doing that? And then that will carry her personality forward in one of those two directions. And this goes again back to what we were just saying with how a lot of narrative driven games basically let you define your version of this character. Again, Mass Effect being the most perfect example of this. I mean, how many people have their own Shepard that they built over the course of that series?
Right, and it's a really good way to allow you the freedom to define who you think this character is.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of give the character a structure and definitely an arc. I mean, there is an arc there for that character in the storyline, but kind of her reactions around that arc are a little bit up to you of who do you think this character is and what would she do in these situations.
Mm-hmm. And as we said, it allows you to build, like, while the game itself, as you said, it has a set end. We're not having 50 different endings in the game,
Right.
but how your version of that character gets the end is entirely up to you.
Right, exactly, exactly. And again, you can piss off some people. They might not want to talk to you. There are moments where, somebody might say to you, "Hey, unless you bring me some crazy thing that I have to defend myself against your accusations, I'm not going to say anything to you anymore." And that will lock out some key information that they may have given you if you had just, not been as aggressive with them.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm trying to think if there was anything else directly related to A Case of Distrust, because I know we're going to talk more about narrative adventure and adventure design in the next few minutes. So, while I'm trying to think of any more questions, I guess from your side, Ben, is there anything else about A Case of Distrust that we haven't talked about that you want to bring up now?
That's a good question. Narrative wise, I mean, we covered a lot of it.
Mm-hmm.
I do think. Let's see. I do like the uniqueness that it's a mystery game, and there's not that many of those. If there are any developers listening, please make more mystery games. I made this game because it was the type of game that I would have wanted to play, and I really think the mystery genre is it's tricky, it's difficult, but I think games can do it maybe better than any other medium because they let you feel smart.
Mm-hmm.
in figuring out, I guess the way that I put it is, if you watch a mystery TV show or read a book or something, you're always a few steps behind the detective. And what's interesting and what's always neat and novel is you sort of thrust part of your personality onto that detective, and so that when they solve it, you feel like you've kind of solved it too, even though in the back of your head you're thinking, oh, of course, how did I miss that? But like, oh, that's cool. I've been on this, journey with this detective. I'm so happy that they solved it. I think in a game it's even more powerful because you're the one doing it. And so kind of my goal with it was to let you feel proud of that moment where you go, aha, of course, this thing. And you find something, or you talk to somebody, or somebody says something to you, and instantly it clicks in your head. And so that's a tricky thing to do.
Yeah.
Because everybody's brain works differently, and that's probably what took the longest on this game. But it is possible, and I'd like to encourage more developers to try that.
Mm-hmm. I think what we were saying a few minutes ago in terms of another part of that difficulty, again, is the fact that you're trying to break the player from just thinking about this as a video game, or more specifically, like an adventure game. Like, as I said, like, when I play an adventure game that has those dialogue options, I'm going to go down every last one just to make sure that something doesn't trigger something else. And it's very hard to, break those. I've lost I can't think of the word I want to use. Break those quirks in a matter of speaking.
The habits that you build up. Yeah.
Thank you. And I guess going back again about the challenge of designing A Case of Distrust, here's a quick question, or this could be a very long one, depending on what your answer is.
It seems like they're all long, doesn't it? I need to shorten these.
But in terms of, again, like designing the game, for people watching this, with your original vision for A Case of Distrust, did the game, I guess, go in any vastly different directions, or did what you originally set out to make is where you finally ended up with?
No, it's very different. And I was talking to Joseph Humphrey from Inkle about this the other day too, and John Ingold, who always says that he's trying to think about different ways to add dynamic stories to games. The initial pitch for A Case of Distrust was actually a game that I'd wanted to call the complete Ben Wander Murder Collection, which was essentially one game where a mystery would generate itself, and you would solve that mystery, and it would be, okay, here's the murderer, and here's the victim, and here's all the suspects, and go ahead and solve it. And it was a narrative-based game that would sort of be different every time you played it. That I'm not sure if that's a solvable problem. I'd like to try it again at some point, maybe. The biggest challenge with that is making it a compelling story that you're interested in getting through with an important arc that you want to play through, while still being able to randomize it enough. So an example of a game that does exactly that is Clue, right? Clue is exactly that. Here's a random person who's the murderer, and here's all of the suspects, and it's up to you to find out, and you can replay it as many, many times as you want because it's always random. But there's no story to it.
Yeah, exactly. I actually thought of an idea, what you just described, Ben, about like a random or procedurally generated mystery murder game. I actually thought of an idea like that like a few years ago, like in my head, but I hit that exact same wall that you did. How do you take something that is going to be both random or procedurally generated and still attach a compelling story to it? It's one of those, that's a grand mystery in of itself, because it's very hard to do something personal at the same time that's completely random or procedurally generated. It's one of the reasons why, as we said earlier, with a game like Spelunky, where it is procedurally generated, that's because there's no story that has to ground that. You can do whatever the hell you want in that game because that's how the mechanics are defined. But how do you make someone care about characters where every time you play a game, everyone could be completely different?
Yeah, exactly. It's very tricky to make that arc quite as personal, and I think you lose.
Hmm.
Maybe it's a scale where you see a graph that the more randomization you have, the less personality, and can you get above that line that sort of goes slopes down and to the right. I don't know. I don't know if there's an answer to make something that's very random but also very interesting from a story perspective, and if there's a way for us to write that without having artificial intelligence or something ridiculous. Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting problem that I have not solved with this game. And there are, if we want to talk about different games that exist out there, one that I haven't tried but I'm dying to play it, and I can't believe that I haven't played it, is Sunless Sea. And that game is about traveling through an ocean, and you essentially run into different things on that ocean. And I believe, I don't want to speak out of hand, that you can that the people that you run into are somewhat randomized, so that you have a different story every time you set out onto the undersea, or the I think that's their name for it. Um, so yeah, I there are different ways to do some of that stuff, and I think in whatever I do next, I'd like to explore that a little bit more than I have in this game, because that's an area that I think games can really push narrative in ways that other media absolutely can't.
Hmm. Yeah, I did play a little bit of Sunless Sea, and I'm also waiting to hear what's going to come with their next game, Sunless Skies, which they did I think the Kickstarter succeeded. It was either late 2016 or early 2017. So definitely curious to see where things go from there. But yeah, like getting back to your point about if there's too much randomness, you kind of lose the personal touch, or you lose like the personality. It reminds you a lot of what I see in like lesser like cartoon shows these days, where each episode the characters have vastly different personalities, and again, it's I think one of those give and takes. Like you want things to be different enough, but you also want them to grow organically. Like as I said a few minutes ago, when you see behind the curtain and you know exactly, oh, if this person says something like this, then obviously the designer program them to be the murderer this time. Like when you lose that mystique, it robs I think the game a lot of what makes it interesting or what makes it engaging to go through.
Yeah, exactly. And again, there are things in a story arc that you want to happen, and if you randomize it, it's a lot harder for those things to happen. Essentially, the conclusion that I came to was, in order to write a random story generator, I'd have to write 50
Yeah.
real stories and then just pull different elements out of a hat. But is that is that really is that a
Mm-hmm.
length of time that is at all reasonable? And the answer is really no. I mean, I don't know how many authors write 50 books in their lives, but I don't think it's something you can really do. And then the other thing is it worth it for the player? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it's kind of fun from a design standpoint. It's a neat thought exercise. But if my player is only going to go through this game once, maybe two or three times, does it matter that it's completely random every single time? And I came to
No.
the conclusion that yeah, it wasn't.
Exactly. And another big point about that, as anyone who watches our casts, or as we talked about before, knows, gamers are really good at tearing apart games. And it is very easy when someone starts to really dig into games to start building a collection of exactly what your game is. As I said a few minutes ago regarding making a procedurally generated game, I could imagine very easily someone knowing, okay, if X trigger happens, then that means that this is the exact path I'm on. We just do that and we beat the game. And
Right.
it's just very hard, I think, to outplay the gamer or the player in these kinds of cases. So it's really a losing battle. So you have to come with another way to make them want to play the game, but as you said earlier, make them feel smart about it as well. Because another like going in the complete opposite direction, you could have a game where the player solves it, but it's completely dumb luck, and they go, "How the hell was I supposed to know all that?" And then they end the game angrily like that.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's my biggest pet peeve in video games when I solve something without realizing it.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a Shigeru Miyamoto image that he drew of where to place a button in front of a door so that players understand the button opens the door. And it's like the simplest puzzle in the world, but the idea is you place the button far enough away that the player needs to search for it.
Oh,
And then once they find it, that's when they understand, okay, this does this thing. And they do it. They don't, if you put the button right in front of the door, maybe they'd hit it or step on it or whatever accidentally, and suddenly they've solved the puzzle without needing to have known
mm-hmm.
the rule set. So yeah, I completely agree with you there.
Mm-hmm. And like getting those affordances right when it comes to like designing the world, it actually goes back to what we were saying in terms of world building earlier, can be very hard. Like we've all played games where there's that ludonarrative dissonance of here's our locked door, but the key is 500 feet down that way, past 5 corridors, up 3 staircases, and 2 elevators. But
I don't know where
that's
you keep your keys. That's where my key hook is. It's at my next door neighbor's house, locked in a safe, so that
mm-hmm,
every time I need to get into my house, I have to go there and ask him for it.
mm-hmm.
I can't be trusted with my keys.
And the only way to open up and the only way to convince them to give you that combination is you also have to solve a some kind of logic puzzle as well, or riddle.
Right. Or no, I have to go on a quest for
Mm-hmm.
him. In order to get this lockbox, I need to go out and get him a beer, and then he'll give that to me.
Exactly. Yeah, Lucio was just mentioning the game McPixel that came out a few years ago. That the whole point of the game was just random adventure game logic that will solve the puzzle. Like, oh no, there's a bridge down. Let me do a cartwheel that distracts a plane that causes it to crash, and then the plane creates a bridge over the gap.
Right.
But yeah, as we were just saying, like that old school adventure game logic where it's just literally just take something, mash into something else, and maybe it will work, or maybe it won't. But that's how we solve these puzzles. I mean, that will drive just about anyone crazy.
Yeah, and so coming back to A Case of Distrust, it was really important for me to give you enough things in your notebook that you can't just randomly try everything. I mean, you could, but you'll spend a very long time there. It's more, I want you to think about, okay, what would be relevant?
Mm-hmm.
There's enough people to ask about things, and there are enough objects to ask about that those permutations quickly become way too large for you to just randomly click on everything. At the same time, that makes the game way harder to design because then I'm assuming that everybody thinks the way I do and would
Oh
solve
yeah.
this puzzle the same way. So it took a lot of iteration, a lot of play testing to get that just right. And I'm really proud that I think it is there.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that's difficult. So I can understand why some adventure games wouldn't do something like that.
Yeah, and trying to make your game not be just think like the designer is a very hard task. Because as you said, it when you design a puzzle, of course it all makes sense and everything works. But how can you assume, everyone who plays your game thinks like you do? And we have seen many adventure games, I know I've played many like that, where it feels like the only way I would have known to solve this is if I was the one who actually designed the puzzle in the first place, rather than, once again, it being or it making sense within the space of the world.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree with that. There's some, very classic, very good adventure games that a lot of it is about finding the item and just trying every item that you have.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I remember being a kid and playing some of those old games and getting frustrated at, I thought this thing could have easily worked and it worked way better than that thing that actually worked in the end. I don't know. I'm thinking specifically of I think it was a Maniac Mansion puzzle, but I can't remember exactly what. You had to like paint a cat so that it had a skunk tail or something. And I'm like, why couldn't I just use the ladder that I have here to climb up? I don't know. It was
Yeah.
something like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But again, it all goes back to what we were just saying that it could be possible to design an adventure game where you can have all these different options, but then of course you're then just compounding work on top of work when it comes to building a game like that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And part of it is I mean, part of the way I solved it isn't necessarily good puzzle design, but it's good hint design. It's
Hmm.
um, putting hints in the game that aren't obviously hints, but enough places, it hints with enough places, and there's a couple characters in the game that you can go back and ask them questions, and they're almost like mentors or something, and they'll give you more of an idea of where to go and what to do while still being kind of in character and in the story. So I thought, I think part of that is why it works kind of well, because maybe in one puzzle your brain just doesn't work like mine, but then you go back and you mention something to this guy, and he goes, "Oh yeah, like I wonder if this thing would do it," and so but hopefully in less obvious ways than that. Like I hope that I'm giving you some hints without you necessarily feeling like the game did all the work for you, you know.
Hmm. Yeah. And again, we could probably spend an entire cast talking about that kind of challenge right then and there.
Yeah, I spent 2.5 years thinking about that kind of challenge.
I know.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm going to do a quick pause here for a time check. We are about, I think, like an hour and 12 into our stream, maybe a little bit more than that. So I figure we'll go and talk more about narrative adventure design and the genre itself, unless there's anything else you want to touch on before, Ben. And for those of you watching this live, if you have any questions, definitely feel free to mention them in chat. I figure in terms of length, we'll probably go for maybe another, I would say maybe another 15, 20 minutes. If there is enough, we'll go further, but we'll probably again stop around 2 hours if we get to that point.
Yeah, sounds good. Let's go ahead. I'm excited to talk about games. I'm always excited to talk about games.
Me too. All right, so I guess with that, any final points about A Case of Distrust? Actually, here's a good one. For people watching this live right now, when is the game due out?
Yeah, so the game comes out on February 8th, and you can get it on Steam or Game Jolt or itch.io or probably just about anywhere I can put it for both Mac and PC.
Awesome. All right, so I think with that, let's talk a little bit more about the narrative adventure genre. I think that will probably take us through to the end of our cast. So here is an always popular question that it always comes up when we talk about narrative-driven games, and that is on the ever-loving topic of the quote-unquote walking simulators. It's always very tricky. The narrative adventure genre, or just narrative driven games in general, is still like relatively young in terms of the vast majority of game designs and genres out there. I guess for you, Ben, I guess the first question then, what are some other like narrative driven games that you really enjoyed over the last few years, or any that helped inspired A Case of Distrust?
Yeah, so not necessarily an inspiration, but I think I already showed my hand a little bit by saying What Remains of Edith Finch was my favorite game of last year, and that's a really good example of something that people might call a walking simulator, maybe in ways that maybe in order to put that game down. But I thought it was brilliant for the story that it was able to tell in this one confined space, and the number of experiences and the different things that it let you do. Yeah, I don't in terms of narrative games that inspired this game, I kind of looked a little bit older. Again, I looked at Phoenix Wright. I looked at Hotel Dusk. I actually looked at a board game that I really like called Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, that really gives you a lot of agency as the player. I mean, it's a very difficult game, and you're probably going to lose at it a bunch of times before getting it right. But I really, really like that game for a lot of reasons. And so that inspired me a ton. And then I'm sure, all of the adventure games I played as a kid are rattling around in my brain somewhere. So those have to have influenced something.
And like staying on that term, walking simulator, it's suddenly become a way for a lot of people to put down narrative-driven games over the last few years. And of course, everybody's favorite question: is it a video game? So I guess as someone who's worked on this for the last 2 years, like, what do you think about that kind of argument over what is and what isn't a video game?
Yeah, I don't know if you're gonna like my answer, because honestly, I don't care. I don't care what you call a video game or don't, or what you call art or don't. It doesn't matter to me. I'll just and maybe it shouldn't be called a video game because in a lot of ways it isn't really a game. I mean, the rule set is really simple. Of hey, go around. It's essentially again, I was watching a talk recently where someone was describing the rule set of Gone Home. And it's essentially if you have a deck of 52 cards, lay them all face down, and one by one just turn them over and see what each one is. And that's really what Gone Home is. But the mechanic isn't the reason you're there. It's not the reason that you're playing the game. In a similar way that, I'll watch a TV show that's 21 minutes long and that has 3 commercial breaks in it. And it doesn't matter that I've already seen another TV show that's 21 minutes long and has 3 commercial breaks in it. They're different not because of, the actual rule set or the structure in there. They're different because of what they contain in terms of content. And that's why I can play a game like Edith Finch and a game like The Stanley Parable and a game like Gone Home and a game like Firewatch and enjoy them all, even though they're essentially the same game, because I'm not there for the game aspect. I'm there for the wrapper.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and again, goes back to what we were saying with other genres as well. I can play Spelunky. That doesn't mean that I'm never going to play The Binding of Isaac. But from that point of view, it's more from the mechanics. But as you said, when it comes to narrative-driven games, it's less about what you do in those games and more about what you experience.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the fact that you are experiencing, I think a lot about why is this a game? Why isn't this in another form of media? I think sometimes sometimes any type of game might be suited better for a different medium if you look at it through a certain lens. But walking simulators in particular, I think, are interesting because you're the one pushing the story forward. This specifically, I mean, I guess this really applies to games that have some type of antagonistic element in it. I'm thinking of, Amnesia, for example, where, I mean, that in a lot of ways could be considered a walking simulator, but that game is so terrifying, and what makes it so horrible is that, at least to me, is that I'm the one telling my character to go forward. I can watch any scary movie and it doesn't affect me at all. I actually had to stop playing Amnesia because I couldn't handle it.
Oh goodness! If we get on horror design now, Ben, we'll be here for like 5-6 more hours.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
But yeah, like when it comes to like narrative-driven games, like that gives up a really interesting point, as you said, about the different mediums and what they can and can't convey to someone. I guess I'm not sure this would be a tangent or a very interesting point, but if we take something like Firewatch or What Remains of Edith Finch or any narrative-driven game, do you think those could work either similarly or not at all if we translate that to another medium? Like, could you imagine something like What Remains of Edith Finch as a movie or as a book?
Yeah, I think I could, but I think it would be more boring. And that's a really interesting question because I don't know why. I don't know why watching, the short hour-long indie film What Remains of Edith Finch would be less engaging to me than playing, the 2 or 3 hour game of What Remains of Edith Finch. And I think a lot of it is really simple in that it's just I'm controlling the story's pace. I mean, that's a good question. I don't know. I hadn't really thought of it, so I'm sort of spitballing and trying to answer it for myself here as well as for you. But I think part of it is being able to control that pacing, being able to explore as much of this house in that game as I want to, or in Firewatch, being able to just walk anywhere in any direction in that forest and see what comes up and see what happens. And when Delilah says, hey, can you check on these wires over there? I have to pull up my map. I have to look at where to go. I have to walk over there. And it's the act of actually needing to do it that I think adds something to the experience, even if it's not challenging. It still feels like it's something that I'm doing rather than something that I'm watching,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah. Last year, I spoke with a guest. We talked about the challenge of adapting video games to other mediums. And one of the things that we brought up, I think, holds true here is that the player experience is a major part of playing these games, or just playing any game in general. As you said, there's a difference between watching a movie that has the same story versus you playing that story. And as we've said before, a video game has a different sense of pacing to it. Like you just said, Ben, like you can spend 10 to 15 minutes just looking around, like walking around a house or environment before you start the story. If you're watching a TV show, you can't exactly have the actor just stand there and, spin around for 2 minutes and doing nothing. And that kind of player interaction is such a big part of playing video games that you literally can't translate to another medium.
Yeah, again, it gets back to that choice, and we were talking about historical fiction earlier. Of if you wanted a historical fiction in a novel or in a TV show, you would have to either show it to the player or not. And in a game, it's more about choice and what you want to experience. I'm seeing Loose Tube on YouTube has some commentary on here on some of my answers. I do want to maybe say that this is all my opinion. I mean, I don't think that anyone else is necessarily wrong because this is how I feel. But I will say, just inherently, without any reasoning for it, I enjoyed playing Firewatch. I enjoyed playing Gone Home. I enjoyed my time with What Remains of Edith Finch. And what we're talking about here is more trying to break down, okay, why did I enjoy that? Well, there wasn't a lot of interaction there. Why did I like this? Why did I like the Stanley Parable? Why did I like all these games? And maybe I'm not coming up with the right answers, but I think it's sort of up to you to decide why you like something and why you don't, and if that has an impact on you. Again, with indie games, what's great is I can like something and you don't have to, but there's enough of me out there that can sustain an indie game that if, the next Battlefield game was a walking simulator, would absolutely bomb at retail because there aren't enough people who like those types of games. But I do like them, and trying to break down why is a really interesting exercise.
Yeah. Yeah, like I said, like for my own personal play style, I am definitely a mechanics guy. Like I love to dig into systems and figure out how things work and try to extrapolate that out. So narrative games aren't as interesting to me, at least at the bare surface level. Like Mr. No Life just said, like gameplay for him is greater than story, and I think for myself, I would have to agree with that. But on the other hand, again, the beauty of these games is that we can all experience them differently. Like, I really did enjoy Gone Home. And as another case in point, last year, did you have a chance to play either Her Story or The Infectious Madness of Dr. Decker, Ben?
Oh, I haven't played The Infectious Madness, but I have played Her Story, and I thought that was a wonderful game also, yeah.
Yeah, I really enjoyed Her Story, and both Her Story and Dr. Decker were two examples of games that didn't have very strong mechanics, but were really amazing, again, as you said, in terms of that wrapper that they gave to the player.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, Her Story is just playing a search engine.
Yeah.
But it's her story. It's the story that comes with that mechanic that I think makes it really, really interesting. And that's not to say that mechanics, it's not to say that I don't like mechanics in games. I think we started this conversation by saying, well, what games do you play? Well, I kind of play everything. Right now I'm playing Dawn of Discovery, or Anno 1404 for European people. But yeah, like that game is so much fun. And I started off my gaming career by designing SimCity. That was on Java phones, pre-iPhone era. Yeah, that was fun. I like that. And so I think there's room for both, and I think there's room for enjoying both or not enjoying them if you don't want to. But I'm not necessarily saying that that one is better or
Hmm.
worse than the other. It's just kind of trying to break down, why do I like this thing?
Yeah, and I think touching on her story there, um, the idea that again, like the player experience, I think really does help to elevate that. Again, there's a huge difference between just watching someone play her story, and again having you as a player think, okay, what do I want to ask the computer next? Oh, they gave me this information. Should I try to type that in? And that level of interactivity, I think, is one of the defining parts, not just of the narrative driven games, but just of game design in general. And Lusu just wrote, I think that's another really good point about Gone Home, that if they added more to that game, like imagine if you had to move boxes, or let's say you had to manually walk upstairs, do left foot, left foot, right foot, yes, that would be more interaction, but would it really add to that experience?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think it's important to define what mechanics you have and why they
Mm-hmm.
exist, why they're there. Like you were saying with her story, if that were a film, that would be a really boring
Yeah.
film. It would just be, shot after shot after shot of a police interview. I mean, I'm sitting in that film for 5 minutes and then walking out and asking for my money back.
Mm-hmm.
But because again, it's that small, tiny interaction. It's that I'm going to play through this search engine that makes you so much more engaged with that story, or at least I found myself engaged with that story. Again, I don't want to speak for commenters who might disagree, but for me, that even these minor levels of interaction add a lot to an experience that maybe game, like we were saying earlier, maybe game isn't the right term for them, and I'm fine with that. Again, I don't care if you call it a game. I just had a good time,
Mm-hmm.
and I hope more people make things like this.
Mm-hmm. Now, here, like talking about that kind of experience, here is something that may be completely random, but I'm going to see if I can try and tie it into this talk. Have you ever played the game Rule of Rose, Ben?
No, I don't know what that is. I've never heard of that.
It's a survival horror game, and fans of Game Wisdom, you can probably take a drink now because I bring this up every time we talk about these kinds of things. But this was a survival horror game for the PlayStation 2. Don't even ask me what year it came out.
Okay.
And the entire game was, it was basically you stuck in this crazy orphanage. Like the children have basically taken over. There's a very much of a Silent Hill aspect to it. Things are just not all there. It's very disturbing. And so the entire game is done in a chapter by chapter format, and it is linear. There is a straight A to Z that you're going to go through in that game. But what they do is at the very end, instead of having an ending that is just, this is what happened, just watch this cutscene, the game's explained. What they do is that the final part of the game is literally the entire orphanage is open and you're free to explore it, and the character will comment on all the things that you come up to, and it kind of just is a way of explaining how the player felt what happened and what really happened versus what you saw. And it was just kind of basically just a massive lore dump that you could pick and choose what you could explore. If you just wanted to end the game, you just walk outside the orphanage, the game ends. But it was kind of very interesting that it kind of attached a narrative adventure to the end of a survival horror game. And like leaning this back, I think this is one of the very interesting dividing points between, again, what is and what isn't a game. When you play a narrative adventure game, there is no preamble. There's no sense of you really getting into this game. It's basically like whenever I play a narrative adventure game, I always go back to Rule of Rose and think, this is just Rule of Rose minus everything that I did to get to that point.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a good point. I'm really curious to understand how many people who played that survival horror game then explored the entirety of the orphanage, and
Mm-hmm.
and in some ways maybe it would be more people than like walking simulators, because it sounds like at that point they've given you enough.
Exactly.
You've spent enough time in that
You're
world.
invested in it.
Exactly. You want the answers. Yeah,
Hmm.
that's really interesting for sure.
Yeah, and that's what I was just thinking about. And I think why a lot of people, as we're seeing in chat, like a lot of people are turned off by the narrative adventure genre, or by the quote unquote walking simulator, is that they don't have a chance to become invested in that world. Now, of course, as we've said, there are games that you don't need to become invested in that world. Mr. No Life just brought up Doom 2016, and I think that's a good point. In that game, the story is just literally thrown by the wayside by the Doom Marine. You don't need to have a grand sweeping narrative about why you're running around chainsaw killing demons. But it would be interesting, but the lore is there if you want to dig into it. But like getting back to Rule of Rose, like I always found that was very interesting that by the end of that game, I did spend a good 30, 40 minutes wandering around that orphanage just trying to make sense of it all because I was invested in that world. But when I played Dear Esther, I spent like 3 minutes looking around like, I don't care about this, I'm going to go play something else because I wasn't invested in what was going on there.
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to what we were talking about, how I read every journal entry in Mass Effect.
Mm-hmm.
If you had handed me a physical journal and said, "Yeah, this is related to something that'll come out in 10 years, don't worry about it, but here, read this," I would have
Yeah.
thrown it in the trash and walked away. There is something to that of the amount of time invested in it, the amount that you like a thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's why people write fan fiction, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's why
Yeah.
that stuff exists, because they're already invested in this world and these characters, and they want to see more and they want to explore it.
Mm-hmm. And I just wonder, like, would someone really want to play a game like that where essentially it's two halves of a game? Like the first half of this game is this very gameplay driven or very horrific situation, and then we end it on a narrative focused game. Like as we said, like Rule of Rose, like to be honest, it did not sell well. I'm pretty sure it did not, be a smashing success from a sales point of view. But from a lore point of view, I thought it did really well in terms of explaining that world. Someone even did like a whole, like you mentioned, of course, fan fiction there, Ben. I remember reading a blog someone did when they tried to put together everything of Rule of Rose into what it meant in real life, like the real life inspirations or the real life lore that would infer on that game. But again, like going back to what we were saying earlier with A Case of Distrust, this would be very much a case of someone saying, I'm going to design a game, but I'm also going to write 50 different endings to that game. Yes, it would grow that game, but how many people will really appreciate all the work that you did to get to that point?
Right, yeah, exactly. If I had gone with the first instinct that I had of let's randomize the story as much as possible, let's write 50 different stories, is that going to be as good as, what it ended up being, which is one very solid arc with multiple trajectories within it? I would argue that I mean I made the argument over 2.5 years of development that the second way would be more enjoyable to more people. Yeah. Sorry. I'm sorry. What was the question?
I don't think there was really a question. But yeah, Loose Tube just brought up the vanishing of Ethan Carter, and like this is one of those things that I'm kind of two minds about. On one hand, I want to play more games where I'm just kind of exploring the aftermath of something, like being able to say, okay, I'm here, let me just figure out just what the hell happened. And as I'm saying that, I'm trying to think of a game that gave me that opportunity, and other than Rule of Rose, I'm not thinking of any off the top of my head. But then at the same point though, or at the same time, my problem though is if I'm just dropped into this world, again, like something like The Vanishing of Ethan Carter or Gone Home or Firewatch, anything like that, am I really going to be invested enough to just, let myself go in these cases? And I think that's one of the reasons why Rule of Rose hooked me so much, because again, it was an 8 to 10 hour long game of me just going, what the hell am I doing? Why are these things attacking me? And then I get to dig into it. Kind of like what you said with A Case of Distress or with something like Hotel Dusk, where you're playing this game and then kind of asks you to go, Okay, so did you figure out what was the point of doing all that?
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think there are smart ways to maybe tie mechanics into what you're doing. And
Hmm.
I guess talking of, Phoenix Wright and why I use a similar contradict mechanic in A Case of Distrust, even though it's a story-based game, there is that interaction there because it makes sense for the detective to
Hmm.
be lied to and to have to prove their case and to accuse somebody and then show the proof of here's why I'm right.
Hmm.
And so I think that maybe if you want to introduce more of a mechanic into these sort of just walking and exploration games, I think you'd have to think of what makes sense in this world with this person. And the Vanishing of Ethan Carter is a really interesting one of maybe there are more mechanics available there because it is again like solving a mystery and things like
Hmm.
that.
Yeah, and the puzzle solving aspects as well. Now, a few minutes ago, Ben, you mentioned the Stanley Parable. And I think that's another really interesting point, again, of how player interactivity adds to this experience. It kind of adds that X factor, I think, to these games. Because again, the Stanley Parable, imagine watching a movie of someone just walking around and things are just randomly happening to them. It would be like the dumbest thing ever. But when the player's the one who's going, I'm going to stand here and jump up and down for 10 minutes, and then the game actually comments on that. It's like, oh my god, the game is actually like responding to what I'm doing.
Yeah, that was a game very much made for gamers in a way that wasn't obvious.
Yeah.
So a lot of that game is subverting your expectations,
Hmm.
which causes a lot of delight because, like you said, oh, I don't expect this thing to comment on this thing, or the game is telling me
Hmm.
go through the left door. If I go through the right, look at that, it's upset now.
Yeah.
And so it adds a personality to a system, which I think is quite interesting.
Yeah. I just thought of another example that would be something like Bastion and the whole narrator who will just comment both on the story and then what you're doing. And again, like as you said, Ben, like as we just said, like gamers, like it's very tricky to write a game that's for gamers like that. Like as we've said, if you give a gamer or like myself, you give me 10 different options, I'm going to try each and every one in order to figure out what the hell they do. And it's always interesting when the game will call you out on that. Or the game is actually responding to what the player is doing rather than the player just doing it all in a vacuum.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that, I mean, especially if you're talking of a system that a player isn't used to, that becomes even greater if you put them in a space that they don't recognize or that they want to mess with. I'm specifically thinking of virtual reality at this point. Of
Hmm.
the first thing that anyone does in virtual reality is try to break everything,
Yeah.
right? And some of the best initial experiences that people have with games are things like Job Simulator, where it does react to everything that you do. It
Hmm.
lets you pick up anything you want, because that's kind of the experience that you want to have initially.
Hmm.
So yeah, I was talking to Ryan Green, who's the lead designer on That Dragon Cancer, and they're doing a lot of stuff with VR these days. And he says, yeah, one of the hardest things is trying to make a serious game in VR these days because everybody just wants to be silly,
Hmm.
and how to play with that as a mechanic that still keeps it within the world. And they were doing stuff like every time you pick up a coffee cup, having the character who's talking to you comment on, oh yeah, that mug was given to me by this other
Hmm.
person, and then continuing the conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lusu just mentioned Papers, Please would be another great example. Again, of how he also mentioned about you don't need to have like super excitement. You can have those mundane tasks that can be very endearing or very interesting. Like just like with Papers, Please. Again, if you're just watching someone give out passports to people, it's like okay. But when you're the one who's actually doing it, that's a different story. And as a very funny point, Mr. Nelly mentioned about throw the mug in his face. I actually did that in Prey. I was just like throwing random objects around. Someone actually commented on that. And Prey would be another example. I'm not the first Prey, but the 2017 one by Arcane, of again of giving the player that freedom to explore what you can and can't do within the game space.
Yeah, I think of Half-Life 2
Hmm.
when I first played that, and that was the first game that really had any sense of, or at least the first game that I played that had any sense of real physics in a space.
Oh yeah.
And I remember the first thing I did was I picked up a can and I threw it at a guard. And
Yes.
immediately, his baton goes up, and then he runs at you, and I'm, oh crap, okay, he actually reacted to that. But that was such an interesting experience, because again, the first time someone tells you, hey, here's this cool new thing, I think everyone's instinct is, how do I break it?
How do I play with this, and what the hell can I do with it? And I did the exact same thing, Ben. Like Half-Life 2, like the first fight was just me like just picking up stuff and just flinging it all around the environment. I think everyone did that, really.
Yeah, and that game actually does a really good job of playing on that, because eventually, you get the gravity gun,
Hmm.
and at the end of the game, I mean, I'm going to spoil a 15-year-old game mechanic or whatever, so hide your ears if you don't want to hear this. But at the end of the game, the gravity gun becomes so powerful, and it's kind of what you
Hmm.
wanted to do with the physics system from that moment, from that very beginning, where you
Hmm.
picked up that little can and threw it at the guard. What you really wanted to do was pick up the train and throw it across the level,
Yes.
and sort of the end of that game lets you do that.
Hmm.
And I loved that and talking about story through gameplay, I guess here, I love that thematic tie-in of, at the start, you throw a can, and I'm sure almost everyone did this, right? But it's one of those things where you're encouraging the player to do this. You put a
Yeah.
can in the world, you tell the player, hey, this game is very physics based, and you show a guard who looks really mean. What is everyone going to do? Well, they're going to throw the can at the
Hmm.
guard. And I love that idea that at the start of the game, you throw the can, it bounces off the guard, and he comes running after you and zaps you in the face. And at the end of the game, you're shooting this giant desk across the room and killing three guards at the same time. It was such a beautiful, I don't know, theme that they
Hmm.
brought throughout the whole game that I thought was wonderful. So yeah, that game. There were some people in chat talking about that game earlier, and
Yeah.
that was one of my favorite gaming experiences in my life.
Yep. And I think that's a really good tie to what we were talking about earlier with A Case of Distrust, or with designing these games in general, is how do you design something that you want the player to do something, but you don't want to tell them to do something? And it's very tricky. And Half-Life 2 is a really great example of that. Even something like Portal as well, where you give the player this cool mechanic and you go, do whatever the hell you want with it. And they're going to, just by virtue of playing around with it, figure out what it does, how it works, what it can do, and you're able to you're teaching the player without outright telling them what to do.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I mean, Portal is brilliant for a number of other reasons, especially, things like uh, loss and giving you something and then taking it away, and making that a really emotional experience. And yeah, that the game designers on both those games are fantastic.
Hmm. All right, quick time check. We're almost at 2 hours into our talk. So I think we're going to start to wrap things up in the next few minutes. Again, we kind of set a soft stop for an hour and a half, but thanks to you guys coming on, it helped give us a little bit more energy. But I think we will be saying goodbye right around the 2 hour mark at this rate. So for those of you in chat, if you have any questions or topics you would like us to talk about regarding narrative adventure design, please get them in now. Consider this our official last call. But we will be wrapping this up in the next few minutes. Because Ben was saying he has a D&D campaign to get to at some point tonight. I don't want to make him late for that.
Yeah, it's true. My DM would be very upset at me.
Hmm. Let's see. Yeah, and like as we are talking about in chat, like the narrative games work, like the mechanics are about finding the story. And I think that's another very interesting point. Again, where that argument again over what is and what isn't a game, and again that's another hour and a half if we wanted to explore that further. But I think that's again why some of these games work for me and some of them don't. Like with Gone Home, And with something like A Case of Distrust or with her story, the mechanics are there for the player to figure out what's going on. Again, the player is interacting, and then that interaction is driving the story. But when I play a game like Dear Esther, and why I think I bounced so hard off of it, was that it didn't really feel like I was the one moving the story. The character starts randomly talking, and it's like, okay, I could just sit here and let him explain to me what's going on.
Right, right. And like you were saying, you're not invested in that yet. I'm curious. So a game that did something very similar was BioShock, where you are just walking around and the story's being explained to you. But because you are there for multiple reasons, you're there to get this story, but you're also there for the first-person shooting mechanic. To you, did that feel more engaging?
Yeah, but I think, again, the mechanics pull you in, and then the world just kind of becomes a part of that. Like, I guess here's a question, and I think this question for you, Ben, as well as for the chat and for people watching this recorded. Imagine if at the end of BioShock, you beat, I forget his name, the giant
Adam
naked
something. Yeah.
You beat the giant naked glowing guy. The game is over. Imagine if before you get on that escape pod, and we get that ending cutscene, the game basically does what Rule of Rose did. That you could spend an hour or however long it took you to walk around Rapture, but you can now do that free of enemies, and the game would kind of give you lore and tell you about what kind of happened there. How many of you would do that at that point? Like, after that whole, how many hours it took you to play BioShock, would you feel invested enough to just, dial things down and explore that world?
See, that's interesting, because I've never played, and I already forget the name of it. I should have written it down. The Roses horror game.
Rule of Rose.
Rule of Rose. I haven't played that, but I will say that after beating BioShock, I bet you, as much as I liked that game, I would probably stop. Now, I might come back if it gave me a save point. If it said right at the end of the game, you can step in this pod or you can walk around, and it made a save right there, I would step into the pod. And then later on, I'd probably come back and walk around that. But I think, a lot of narrative games are designed with this sort of arc in it, where at the end of BioShock, I was exhausted. I had just gone through a whole bunch of stuff, and even though that final boss wasn't that difficult, it was an arc that had ended with a finale that was very bombastic, and I think I was glad that that game had ended right there. I don't think, in fact, I probably would have been a little bit more disappointed in it if it had this exploration scene right at the end, because then I would feel, oh, I'm losing out on something. It's almost like you were saying, that adventure game mentality of I have to click on every single option, because if I don't do this, am I missing out on something? I loved this game. Shouldn't I explore everything in this world? So I guess in some ways I'm glad that they didn't do that. But I think it would have been cool if at the end of the game they sort of unlocked another option that said it was exploration mode, and it just let you walk around, because maybe 3 days later I'd come back to that and then try that out. I think that could be interesting.
Yeah. Or what we were hearing about with Assassin's Creed Origins, with having the Sightseer mode, where it was just basically the game, but with none of the gameplay. It was just all about Egyptian history and how things worked. And again, I think that would be interesting. Like, again, it's very hard to say who would be the audience for that, but I just wonder if people who, after playing Assassin's Creed Origins, will go back and say, hey, this was very interesting. I want to know more about Egyptian history. Let me take a look at this.
Yeah, that's interesting, because they already have all the assets and everything built out for that. They've already done the research and they've already made the game. I think that could be really cool, especially as I'm sitting here just randomly thinking about stuff. I'm sure there's reasons that they don't do this, but it might be interesting if they had an add-on VR mode that was just, hey, this isn't really a game, but it's almost like an exploration.
A
It's a
sightseeing
virtual.
tour, essentially.
Exactly. It's a sightseeing tour of a place you can't go to anymore
Hmm.
because it's not there,
Yeah.
you know. So in terms of learning about Egyptian history, that is way more fun to me than popping open a textbook and reading about it.
Yeah.
If I'm walking around it virtually, that's super engaging.
Hmm. And I think, as we said, the challenge, though, is getting the player invested in that in the first place. Because, as you just said, Ben, imagine if Assassin's Creed Origins had started you and say, you must go on this 40-minute sightseeing tour of Egypt before you get to play. People wouldn't want to do that. But if they've already played through like an entire 10 or how many, I don't even know how long that game is, experience, and then go, that was interesting. I want to know more about it. Hey, there's this mode. That's a different story. And LoseTube said this a few minutes ago. I've done a lot more in games just to find more answers to what's going on. And again, I think that's the magic point here. That if the player becomes invested, they're going to want to explore everything there is. I mentioned Dark Souls earlier in this cast, but that is the pitch point or pitch perfect example of that. How many people played through Dark Souls, saw those little lore options, and then at the end go, what the hell was going on? I need to figure out more. I mean, we've mentioned, of course, there are YouTubers who have put out these massive lore dumps or lore explanations of that game, and there is a massive story. But at the same time, you can completely disregard it if you wanted to.
Yeah, there's this, and I forget the name of the game. I should really remember it because I wanted to do well. It was a game I kickstarted a few years ago that's coming out pretty soon. That's basically Skyrim in medieval Poland.
I think I know the one you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm gonna remember it after and kick myself for
Yeah.
it, but it's interesting to me because I'm a really big fan of learning history and learning about different cultures and kind of seeing how their history shaped the people who live there now. And I didn't get hooked into Skyrim's lore, but I think I would get hooked into medieval Poland's lore. And so things like that to me are really interesting and would take me further into the game. I had a neighbor growing up who played a lot of Dynasty Warriors and basically learned like Chinese history 101 from that, even though obviously Lu Bu is an anime character with a giant spinning stick that kills 7,000 people, you know. But he understood I haven't played them, so I don't know this, but he said he took a course in college that was about Chinese history, and he said, I recognize all of these characters. I know all of the battles that happened. I know all of the different countries that were in China at that point, or the different factions. And he said, I know all of this because I just played a ton of these games when I was 12 years old.
And as a quick tangent, it does make me wonder. I know, I can't believe I forgot the name of the studio. The studio does the Total War games. They're making a Total War game based on Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And I just wonder if will include Lu Bu in that as a little like Easter egg for people.
Right, exactly.
The historical context of a man just walking around killing 10,000 people by himself. But yeah, like you never know. Like this again goes back. We can even tie this into A Case of Distrust about how these very interesting topics can inspire us to make these video games or to learn more about it. Like for myself, like watching a lot of like the stuff on Discovery Channel and History Channel has gotten me a real appreciation for how things work mechanically or how people restore these old objects and stuff like that. And again, that's something I would have never have picked up on my own. The same thing with video games. Like when we start to play a game about an interesting historical context or historical period, you never know what's going to inspire someone to then want to learn more about it.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is about framing. It's about teaching somebody something in a way that they're receptive to it. And some of that's entertainment, and some of that is, some of that is literal camera framing, making it look nice, giving it a story, giving it a soundtrack. I think there's a lot of ways to learn things that we're not necessarily taking advantage of now. And I'm starting a completely different tangent on, education in games that we shouldn't start now because it
Yo,
will take us another 6 hours to get through that.
exactly. But if you're free in the future, Ben, it was always great to talk to you again. I mean, again, we touched on a lot of interesting topics. The whole thing about a procedurally generated adventure game, I would love to talk with you more about that in a future cast.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know that there are a lot of designers already
Hmm.
thinking about that. It's such a difficult problem again to make it feel like it's written for you, even though it's completely random.
Exactly. But time wise, yeah, we're about to go over that 2 hour mark. And again, we could talk, who knows, at length about any other topics, but let's start to dial things down. Let's begin to wrap things up. So, again, just to reiterate, A Case of Distrust, that should be out, you said, I think, February 8th.
February 8th, that's right.
All right. And will be available on Steam, Humble, and did you say GOG as well?
Probably you'd have to talk to Z about that. I
Okay.
don't know exactly all the stores, but yeah, Steam, Itch, probably Humble, Game Jolt, GOG, probably, yeah. I would hope that anywhere you'd want to find it, you could get it.
Great. And like I said, I'm going to be trying to put together a first look video, hopefully not too spoiler filled, right around that time. So for those of you watching this either live or recorded, be sure to check that out. But I guess otherwise for you, Ben, do you have any final thoughts or anything you'd like to say to wrap the cast up on?
Yeah, this was a great time and a really fun discussion, and I'm glad it didn't just center around A Case of Distrust, because that is something that my life is centered around for the last 2.5 years. So it's good to finally take a breath. It's good to finally, go out for a jog again and to be able to talk about games that aren't mine. So yeah, this was a really good time. Yeah, I'm super excited for the release of A Case of Distrust. And I'm excited to, in 3 years, come back and completely dissect and break down that game with you again.
Great. And yeah, I don't want to keep you locked up anymore, Ben. You need to get out and see the world once again.
Right. Yeah, exactly. They have this whole thing called the outdoors.
Mm-hmm. Some strange place I've never been to. But I think with that, let's wrap things up for tonight. So, for those of you who've been enjoying this either live or recorded, thank you so much for tuning in. If you're watching this record and would like an ad-free version of this early, be sure to check out patreon.com/gwbeister to find out how to get access to those VIP versions. And of course, be sure to check out A Case of Distrust when it is out. And Ben, again, thank you so much for hanging out with me this Saturday afternoon. And like I said, if you're free in the future, once you've gotten tired of the outdoors, it'll be great to have you back on.
Yeah, for sure. This was fun. I'll be on anytime.
Awesome. So with that said, we're going to end things here. If you're watching this live, I'll be doing our Saturday night grab bag later this evening. And for those who've been enjoying this recorded, be sure to check back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. So until our next stream, have a great afternoon or a great night for those of you watching this recorded. But until then, take care.